Hello there, and welcome to your Bamboo Chalupa digital marketing podcast. My name is Brett Snyder. I am the owner of Knucklepuck, and I'm joined by Nate Shiver, the author of shiverweb.com.
Hello, hello.
So today on our 40th episode of Bamboo Chalupa, we're going to talk about one of the most undervalued aspects of running a marketing campaign, and that has to do with the actual management of that project. And I think a lot of times people pride themselves on wearing so many hats or being able to multitask and having a clear organizational structure. And I think a lot of times people tend to embellish, how strong their skills are in that respect, when in reality, there have been a lot of studies that have been done that show that you have to have a defined plan, you have to have a process in place to be able to effectively leverage different parts of your brain and different parts of your team. And so what we want to talk about today is how Nate and I use project management tools, whether that be software, whether that be processes, or just kind of homemade hacks to help us manage our marketing projects.
My background started as, a freelancer where I didn't have any systems, any processes. I moved through a marketing agency, and it's where, when I was there working with Brett, is where I picked up a lot of the software and ideas. And when I went back on my own, I decided that even though it was just me, and now it's me, an assistant, that there were kind of 5 big reasons that I decided I actually have to manage my projects and not just wing it based on skills that I had developed. And Brad, I'm sure some of these reasons overlap, but I mean, like you said, it's important to keep everything in order and to have deadlines, because I know if you have sticky notes or just notes scattered everywhere, things get lost. And the second thing is that I found, especially at an agency, but even now on my own, is that if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. I mean, the definition of a priority, right, is that there's one thing to do. And even though there's plenty of opportunities, especially in marketing, technically everything could have a payoff. You have to decide what's important. What are you actually going to work on right now compared to something else?
And I talked to my content manager about this morning, because we're starting to figure out that we've got a good process in place, but the gears are spinning so fast that we don't really know how to slow it down to a manageable pace. And someone's like, you need to protect high priority. That needs to be a guarded resource for you if something is labeled as high priority, because that needs to immediately jump to the front of your queue. And if you don't have, I think that if everything's a priority, nothing is. I love that kind of mentality to it, because there is no prioritization if everything needs to get done with the same degree of intensity or the same deadline. It's not sustainable. It just simply is not. And being able to understand that you have to guard high priority, where there should be a finite number of things that meet very specific criteria before you're willing to upend your entire plan. Because that is going to push other things back when you have steps later in your strategy that rely on prerequisites, rely on the ability to complete some research before you can actually draft the content, before you can optimize imagery.
No, I love that. I love, the idea of prerequisites, and a project management system forces you to put all that down and document it. And which I think leads to my third big reason, is that it's the fact that if something is not documented, in some ways it doesn't exist. I call this, capturing creativity. And, we all have those moments, in the office or at home or, in the shower, or when we're out walking, you have a great idea of something that needs to be done, if not right now, but at some point in the near or long-term future. And if you don't have a place where you can put that idea where you'll come back to it and prioritize it, in a lot of ways it doesn't exist. I know I was very guilty years ago of putting stuff down on Post-it notes or putting something down in a text file on my computer. And it would be a great idea, something that it didn't need to be done right now, but medium term it would have paid off, and it gets lost. And having a project management system forces you to document it in a single place and to prioritize it so that you will come back and get it done.
And even if we're not talking about necessarily it getting lost, but think about the last time that you've had to go on a vacation. When you sit there and you say, if you had to pack everything in an hour, you're going to forget some things most likely, because you're trying to run through this mental checklist. You're trying to cover everything without any sort of way of capturing, the thoughts that go through your head. This gives you a chance that even if you just write it down, you put it in a place to say, come back to it later. I've got a folder on my desktop just called ongoing ideas. I like it because I keep my desktop very clean. It's something where I know that I can go back to that. If I'm like, hey, I have a spark of creativity or I need something to do, I've got that folder where I've got things organized. I've got an Evernote folder as well. We're just writing down random thoughts, random ideas. I've done things as far as when I've been on trips. I go out to a buddy of mine flies jets for the Navy. And when he came back to the States, we did a trip to Atlantic City with some friends of ours. And I'm kind of an early riser on those types of weekends and wanted to give everybody a chance to sleep in. So I sat and walked around the beach and actually recorded my thoughts just to be able to have something down, to capture those ideas, send them back over to rev.com, get them transcribed. And then I had a list of kind of inspiration or notes that was tangible. It was something concrete.
I love that point, especially about technology. I mean, with smartphones and every project management system having an app, I mean, there's really no excuse to not use it. I mean, it's really a purely discipline issue to pick one and actively use it, no matter where you're at, no matter what you're doing. And I love that example of how even when you're out on the beach recording your thoughts, you can have that in a single place and make use of it.
And I think we're going to see that throughout the rest of this episode is this idea of discipline. We can give you all the tools in the world, but you have to be disciplined. That's really the core of project management, where all of these other tools are just ways to make it easier to stay disciplined. But the fundamental piece here that cannot be fabricated, that you can't fake it, is applying that discipline.
Yeah, and I think, that leads into the fourth big reason that I had down, and that is preventing what I call shiny object syndrome. This is especially a problem in SEO, where it seems like every week Google is rolling out, this week we're adding rich snippets for reviews. Oh, this week, we're rolling out AMP. All news publishers should have AMP. This week we're rolling out, something new for Google Plus. We're rolling
authorship
back
is rolling back in.
Oh, I know.
Right?
And every week there's all kinds of new things flying at you. And there's always going to be something interesting and novel and something that you could do. But the thing about SEO and all marketing really is about consistently executing on what your strategy has predicted to be successful. And to do that, you have to have it written down, defined, and say, this week we're going to execute on this. This is what has to be done. You can't go chasing every shiny little object, every little new feature that comes out, because otherwise you're never going to get the big campaign, your big assets, your technical audit, the fundamentals executed on.
Right. And I think it just comes down to the fact that it has to get done. At the end of the day, you are judged and your marketing campaigns are a matter of getting shit done. We actually have that poster on our wall. It's a quote from Aaron. I guess can't really be truly attributed to one person, but from Aaron, I think Levy from Box, that kind of it's a big yellow poster because it kind of runs through what we want to do. I've had people ask me, when I explain to them what NucklePuck does in terms of providing SEO services. It's like, well, can't I do that myself? Like, well, yeah. In a lot of ways you can. A lot of ways it's just making sure that you consistently execute on this plan. And it's something where I often ask them, it's like, theoretically, you could make your own clothes. You won't be out on the street naked, but you're not going to be winning any fashion shows. And I think project management is the key piece to that.
Yeah, and I think because there's a lot of subtle benefits and secondary benefits of having a defined system and not just doing it all yourself with your paper and text file. And I know with apps like Trello and Basecamp and all the others, they have a system of prerequisites, ways that you can make a project into a series of steps. Because I know that, let's say you want to do a tech audit. Well, before you can do a tech audit, you have to have access to the back end of the site. You have to have access to webmaster tools. And so if you compare it to just writing down, I need to do a tech audit and then going to do it, if you are able to break that task, that project down into the prerequisites, into the requisite steps, it will make sure and it will help you actually get it done because it's outlined, it's visible. It's a way that you can knock down barriers and actually get those things done.
Right. And you mentioned a couple of tools that I'd like to kind of start talking about in a little bit more detail. You had mentioned Trello and you had mentioned Basecamp. There's a couple of different tools that we use, but talk me through, Nate, especially because we've got a little bit of a different process, given that I've got, I wouldn't say more moving parts, but definitely different moving parts that we have to try to kind of coordinate for a cohesive approach. So talk to me about some of the tools that you use and how you've worked them into your process.
Like you said, mine, I do think mine has much fewer moving parts just because I have fewer people. It's mainly just me and my sister Lydia, who's my editorial assistant. And everything that we do is focused on publishing. Mainly my main website, shiverweb.com. And so we have a really minimal setup. I use Trello and Google Drive exclusively for all business projects. And on Trello, we basically have 10 boards set up. Each board is either a project or an aspect of a project. So I have five boards for shiverweb.com, which is the main website, main project. I have a asset board, which defines kind of the bigger content assets. So like development tools that I have going, very long form, standalone guides or my quizzes, that kind of thing. We have a optimization and internal board, and this is, tech audit stuff, optimization things, tweaks to the website, miscellaneous stuff. Promotion board, which is outreach, email, that kind of thing. Paid campaigns, which are all of my AdWords, Facebook, Twitter campaigns, and then publishing is the main board, which defines, what actually goes on the blog. And when I say boards, basically in Trello has boards where you have cards, and these are cards that you give names, you can assign checklists, add comments to, and we kind of move them across. On the show notes, I'll actually link to a screenshot of my board setup, but most every board is set up into a to-do column, a doing column, and a done column. And when you add a card, publish this blog post, it starts out life in the to-do column. When we actively start working on it, it goes in the doing column and then it moves to done.
And I think to kind of visualize it a little more clearly for people who may not be familiar with Trello, think about, we talked about the standard write ideas down on Post-its. But now imagine if you could also attach images to that Post-it. You could attach URLs to that Post-it. You could put a checklist on the back of that Post-it, that you could have other people add notes into that Post-it. So we have all of the information about this kind of independent thought in one place on one Post-it. And then the different boards or the different lists that Nate is talking about is you can actually move that same Post-it through the process. So I think the to do, doing, done is a very simplified way of looking at it that makes a lot of sense. To kind of take that a little bit deeper, for example, our content team, we've got a column for, brainstorm, then we have our topic, outline. Then we go for initial research. Then we talk about first draft, final draft, adding images, adding internal links, being able to do final QA when it goes into WordPress, and then publish. So the same Post-it moves its way through all of these lists so that you know what is going on at each point in the process, but that the information about that goal or that task is very self-contained. The way that I've looked about it is actually, I don't refer to Trello as a project management tool. I actually refer to it more as a workflow management tool because it allows you to have a consistent workflow throughout repeatable parts of your process.
It's interesting how different people break Trello down into different ways of organization. Like you said, you guys have a first draft column. I make use of Trello's checklist. So like each card, say, this blog post, it'll actually have a checklist instead of first draft, I'll have a outline checkbox, a proofing checkbox, a first draft checkbox. And so as it moves in the doing column, we just checkbox it. So either way, I think the main takeaway is that there's a million ways to do it. The key is to set it up in a way that makes sense to you.
And I think what's interesting about the way that we do it is we do it that way because we have different people who are piecing into the process. Right. When you're the one moving through the checklist, that's great. But we've got, the content, the SEO folks that do some of the research. We've got the writers that actually write it, the content manager that reviews it. The SEO folks do the internal linking, again, once it's created. Our development team is able to actually get things up on the site. So we have to break it down because we've got different places. But I think to your point, Nate, there's a lot of different ways, depending on the needs of your organization, that you shouldn't think of these tools as something that says you have to do it my way, but you have to just understand the power that this tool can have for helping you visualize the progress of a task as it works its way through your strategy.
Well, let me ask you this. So I use the labels to assign it to a person. So like if I see a green label, that means I'm supposed to be working on it. If it's yellow, that means that Lydia is supposed to be working on it. Do each of your team members, are they in charge of a column? So like when it moves to proofing, one of your team members, like they're in charge of that column, or you have different people who are in charge of internal linking, or does it just all depend on the card?
Yeah, so we actually tried both ways of it. The way that it works for us, because we don't necessarily have one person who is assigned to every piece of every task. It's something where one of our SEO support folks is responsible for internal linking. Now, that could be one of several people, whoever has the availability or things that can be moved around easily. But the SEO support folks know that anything in this column, somebody can grab from there. So instead of it having to be assigned to a individual person, it's almost assigned to a role. And then somebody within that role can be able to step in and say, okay, I understand this is what is expected of this role at this point in the process. I can do that. And when it's completed, I move it to the next step.
I like that. That sounds like it allows for a lot of flexibility.
It allows us to scale in a way that assigning individually doesn't work, because if somebody falls behind, if somebody is sick, your process is not reliant on if you take one domino out, the entire place, the entire system doesn't finish. It's something where it allows us to be a little bit more flexible and use interchanging parts so that people can step in where they can contribute. It's something I can jump in and say, hey, I actually have some extra time here. Let me see if I can move things along. It's very clear. And, think about it as if I had to email you a request for everything that was all kind of self-contained in my inbox. This way, all of it takes place. It stays there. And then whoever has the opportunity to be able to affect change at that part in the process can jump right in.
It sounds very much like, have you ever read the book, The E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber?
I have not.
Okay. It's kind of it's a book about formalizing processes and breaking down tasks in a business based on role and not on person. It was a little bit of a controversial book, but I think it is kind of a fundamental way of looking at businesses, especially when you have things that, even though they're not repeatable processes, they are a specific role and they do have specific steps. And when you are able to define those like you guys have and have anyone step in, that removes a lot of bottlenecks and it makes the business as a whole function much, much better, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's the foundational basis of the assembly line.
Oh, yeah.
Where you start to being able to say, like, it's not who needs to get something done, it's what needs to get done. And then being able to have the who step in and be a little bit more fluid, but the what doesn't change.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple other things that I do with my Trello board that were really good for me and my organization. And that was one, I don't use Trello's attachment function. What I do instead, anytime a piece of content is going to have really any content form, like images or text, anything, it gets an assigned Google Drive folder that has the same naming convention as the card, and the first comment on that card is that folder. And so,
see what you should do, Nate? You should attach that drive link as an attachment,
yes,
because it will keep it at the top of your card. Now, if you add other comments, that gets pushed down. This is something that my team taught me, where it's like you get the link up there, but you can actually attach a link. So that way it's always pinned to the top. So think about it. If you added five more comments, you got to scroll to that drive link.
Right.
You can put everything in the drive folder, but I actually did that with, putting some photos up of our office build out, but attach the URL because it pins it to the top of your card.
Okay. See, that's perfect, because basically what I didn't want to happen, if we have a multiple image post, I didn't want to attach 12 different images and have to download those and upload to the website. I want everything in one Google Drive folder, but that's a really good way to keep it, permanently assigned to that card.
Right. And these are the things where you start to realize, what Trello can do for you.
Yeah.
Another example, you talked about some of the colored labels. I use the colored labels for our recruitment process. So I have different colors for people who applied for an SEO role versus a developer role versus a writing role. I can look at it there and say, all right, I get a good sense. You can filter by colors. So if somebody wants to say colors are, you can do, red, orange, and green. It's like, high, medium, and low, or, stop and go. There's different ways that you can use some of these visual elements here to be able to see what is in front of you as far as your workflow.
I will say that one of the things that I think is critical for anyone first starting a project management system is to define a naming convention. So that is basically, how do you write out the titles of the cards? Just like, how do you write out the file names that you have? So
I think you should do that for anything. Document management with, really just as a basic organizational structure.
Yeah.
I absolutely think you should have that beyond just cards. Have it be your folders, your drive folders, your attachments, your, any of your files that you share.
So aside, and also in Google Analytics, what I think, I know for both of us, one of the most maddening things when logging into a client's analytics account, when they've been setting up their own custom UTM codes for ad campaigns, it's like, some of them are lowercase, some of them are uppercase. They mix up the medium and the source. But so yeah, I would say, if your organization does not have a defined naming convention, it's really tedious to set up and think through. But just spending just a few minutes will save so much time.
And it's one of those things, it's almost like a filter in Google Analytics.
Yes.
Where it's not going to apply to your historical data. And you can go back and rename your files, but don't look at it as something where it's all or none. But you got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
You got to establish your naming convention. And I know for me, for example, and we have it in our onboarding folder for all of our new folks, they learn our naming convention, where we go client name, even if that's Knuckle Puck internal, it's Knuckle Puck. We go client name, space, dash, space. Then you put whatever the title of it is, just a description of what you're doing, space, dash, space, and then the date. And the date has a consistent format, so we know we're using dots instead of slashes. We know we're using 16 and not 2016. And so that way, when you're scanning through, on the right side, you can see the dates. On the left side, I have it by folders or by client anyway, but it's easier to remember. And then if you put the same client name, that doesn't affect your alphabetical listing, now goes by the name of the title anyway. Right. So as long as you're consistent with that, it pays huge dividends in terms of scale, really.
Oh yeah. And none of it's rocket science. It's just a matter of doing it first time and then being disciplined to follow it for every other time after that.
Yep. And it's something where as you download files, that's why one of the biggest things gives me, it just makes my eyes twitch, is seeing a disorganized desktop.
Oh yeah.
I got dropped in on by about 4 people in my family over Easter to be like, oh, you're good with computers? Can you fix my computer? Can you fix my iPhone? Can you fix this? My girlfriend gave me a new computer. Can you help me reformat it so I can put my files on there? So like, all right, sure. And open it up. And there was, I kid you not, probably 200 files on the desktop. No. Ones where it's like they stacked on top. So even hitting delete, I had to go to trash over and over. And that to me, it becomes unwieldy. It becomes something where at that point, what are you really doing? And if you don't have any naming convention, you can't even use search. You can't even search for these files anymore. So you're really just relying on remembering where it is or downloading it every time. Again, I talked earlier about this idea of repeatable processes. And that's what project management is. It's the discipline to be able to develop and adhere to repeatable processes.
Well, all right. So let's switch over to prioritization, because I think no matter what project management tool you have, I think the Achilles heel is deciding what's the number one important thing. I know at our previous agency where they use Basecamp, which instead of cards, it relies on to-dos. For me, it was half impossible to know ahead of time which to-do was the number one thing to do. They were just all in a group. And the same way with Trello, at least for me with multiple boards, on first look, you don't know whether to do the card in publishing or the card in assets or the card in optimization. And I've developed kind of a flow chart hierarchy for figuring that out. But since you have multiple person team, I'd like to hear how does one person open up your Trello boards and see what needs to be done right now?
So on the development, the content side, I can certainly speak to that. On the actual agency management, we're still working it out in terms of what the best way to do it is. We're still using a lot of Basecamp because I view like I said, I see Trello as workflow management. I see Basecamp as communications management. It gives us a central location to contain the communications internally and with the client. But as far as actually prioritizing what the impact should be, we're still using kind of basic standard lists. It's one of the things why it's a big reason why we have our weekly or biweekly calls with our clients. It's not just to be able to keep them apprised on the project, but it forces us to put together an agenda, to prioritize items in that agenda based on the anticipated impact. It's something where this is one of those situations where there is no magic bullet. It isn't something where we figured something out that is completely groundbreaking that nobody else has. We just stayed disciplined to the approach. On the content and the development side, it's something where you can move cards around in a list to say what's the top priority. We can start to say, everything that we look back to is like, what's going to have the most impact to drive business growth? That's kind of the way that we prioritize. And with Trello, we can move cards up and down. With Trello, you can actually set, I think they're called, you can set due dates on Trello cards, but you can also set, it's some sort of like a decay tool where the card will actually start to fade if you haven't addressed it in a week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting feature. I've started playing around with that, especially on the optimization and internal board, where it's easy to put off, especially quick wins. There's a million things that they literally take 15 minutes, but they're also the tasks that are very easy to procrastinate because they are, so small, but in aggregate, they can add up to the quick wins.
It's long tail. You don't target one long tail query.
Right.
You target 50.
Right.
And you find a way to be able to sometimes you have to make a title tag tweak to an individual page to target one of those long tail. But you make 25 title tag tweaks, you start to see an aggregate lift. You've done something right. You can build, measure, learn on that approach.
Yeah. And my approach is still fairly old school. That it's probably an apocryphal story about Charles Schwab and a guy on a train who recognized him. And the guy went over to Charles Schwab and he's like, how do you get stuff done that made you so much money? And Charles Schwab he said, well, every morning I write down the 3 most important things, and then I do those 3 things. And that's the story. It's nothing super fancy, nothing super complicated. And for me, when it comes to, what am I actually going to be doing? I write down 3 things that I need to do. Now, as far as the actual Trello board and synchronizing with Lydia and even myself, I have sort of a flow chart hierarchy. So, publishing comes first. If there's something that is in doing on the doing board and publishing and it has a due date, that always, that gets done first. Usually those move forward and we start to get like a 1-week buffer. Then you move down to assets. So, like these are long form guides or things that are in development that need to get done. They're more medium term. Same thing, is something actively doing that can be worked on. And then we move down to optimization. If there's something there, then it goes. And then if we have more time, and again, this is all as we get buffers for those boards, you start to move down, and then lower down is promotion and then, paid. And that's kind of the hierarchy of importance. The one thing that I will say is that the optimization board has what I call emergency powers, mainly because if the website is down or there's a technical problem, anything of that sort, that trumps everything. So, obviously if your website's not live, nothing else really matters. So, that can beat everything, even publishing deadlines. But as a general rule of thumb, I have that kind of flow chart of importance. Lydia has that same flow chart where if this board is done, then you move to this one.
So what do you do? It sounds like a lot of this is predicated on creating that buffer.
Yes.
What happens when you're not finding the time or ability to create that buffer to move to the next board?
That's usually a monthly process. So once a month, I have a I don't know if I mentioned, but on the publishing board, I have a 30-day to do. So the to do board, I can put whatever I want to, but every month, I move cards from the to do board to the 30-day editorial calendar. And that's what's going to get done on the blog for 30 days. I also look at the other boards, and if stuff just is not getting done, then I either need to allocate more time, and that might mean deleting cards, or maybe reducing my publishing schedule. So it took me a year to move to twice a week publishing to 3 times a week publishing. And when I made that move, it was very, very deliberate. And it only happened after I cleared out all the big wins from the other boards.
Right. And I think that speaks to something, that is really essential to project management that I don't think that we've talked about much. And that has to do with not only time management, but making it an active step in your process to do a retrospective on whether or not your process is working.
Yes.
Because people love to establish, hey, this is the ideal situation, and then reality comes and kicks you in the teeth in terms of what you can physically get done. If you overestimate what you're going to accomplish in a given week, if you don't account enough time for unforeseen distractions, if you try to say, well, it didn't work last month, so it's going to work again this month. I think it was, one of the, Einstein, Franklin kind of things. Like, insanity is defined as doing something over and over again and expecting a different result. I wish I remembered who it was, but I think it's a really apt kind of comment there, because you have to look back and say, did this work? Your project management cannot be something where it feels unattainable. It's not a wish list. Your project management system can't be viewed as aspirational. It has to be something that you can stick to, something that you can execute on, and something that you can feel as though you have accomplished what you've laid out in front of you without being overwhelmed.
Yeah, I think the most useful thing, so in addition to the monthly sort of, deleting and reprioritizing everything, is at the end of the year last year, if you're documenting everything that you should be documenting, you can say, I did this in 2015. And if anything, that will give you a benchmark. And you can, I knew generally how many hours a week I worked. And I could say, you know what? I didn't publish 20 guides. I didn't publish, 10 development tools. I published 2 tools, and I published 5 guides. I could say I published 50 newsletter editions, but I could say, you have a solid number. And then when you're planning the next year, you can, instead of setting wildly unrealistic New Year's resolutions or, New Year plans for the next year, you can look at last year and say, okay, am I realistically going to do more, or am I going to do less? And you can take those benchmarks. And I think the key is to have a real clear-eyed look at reality and what you can and can do, and decide what's really important. And
I think the idea is to succeed.
Yes.
You want to succeed. This is not something where, this is not where you put a challenge to yourself. Now, obviously, you want to make sure that you're allocating your time appropriately, but this isn't something that should feel like you had to struggle or really battle to accomplish. You want to set yourself up so that you can succeed. If you want to say, this year I want to run a marathon, it's like, maybe start with a 5K.
Yeah.
Maybe start with a 10K. Be able to set attainable goals, because it doesn't preclude you from accomplishing more. And I think that's one of the big things with project management, is a lot of people have this, shoot for the moon, because if you land, you miss, you land among the stars. But you really want to set attainable goals for yourself. So that way, if you exceed those goals, it's that idea of under promise, over deliver that we preach in, kind of in an agency perspective all the time, where set realistic goals, manage expectations, but also understand that you are not inhibited by those expectations. You can always do more, but you want to make sure that you're not falling short of the goals that you've set for yourself.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think one way I wanted to wrap this episode up is to talk about our wish list and things that, you wish you were doing now that you want to do in the coming months, or hopefully maybe will be invented in the next year? I know, for example, Slack is something that it's funny with innovation. So I wish that had existed a few years ago, but now that it exists, it's like everyone is saying, why did this not exist years ago?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And a few things that I'm working on and looking for solutions. One, I use if this then that a lot for social sharing. But I've been really looking into Zapier, which is a very similar service. It's more paid and more focused on business services, that set up triggers.
And for people who aren't familiar, Zapier, it allows you to integrate. It creates a bridge between independent software tools that allow them to speak to each other.
Yeah. So like if I add a card on Trello, then a folder automatically gets created in Google Drive. It's not something where I have to manually go and do things on both services. If I do something on one service, Zapier takes care of the other one. And for that,
I gave the example earlier for our recruitment funnel.
Yeah.
Where I'm looking into when I get a contact form through WordPress, then it creates a card and attaches the resume and assigns the label for the position and does all of that. So I can just open Trello and see, our job board or our applications that way, so that it takes anything that can be automated should be automated. Yes. In this day and age.
Yeah. But the trouble is, there's that constant trade-off between, right now in this moment, it's quicker for me to do it manually. It's the front loading work versus lots of work over time. And so yep. I need to be more disciplined about front loading the work and automating it. Okay. Let me know if you've solved this problem, is formatting conventions across all text editors. So I mainly use Google Docs, but I publish in WordPress. I also use TextEdit. And then occasionally I have to use Microsoft Word for some awful reason, usually when you send me an attachment, honestly.
Yeah, I get that criticism is shared by some folks on our team that we need to stop using Word.
Either way.
You've gotten me into the age of Slack. You've got me, let me come out of this. I'm trying to learn Snapchat, which I just don't understand. But I'm trying to embrace these new
all these newfangled devices. But what's maddening about all these newfangled devices, especially in text editing, is that there's still no single formatting standard. So I will write something in Google Docs. I would put in the headings, the H1, H2, H3, all that. Copy it over to the WordPress text editor, but it doesn't transfer. And even if I know all the tricks that you can do to import it, it never does it right. It just never does it right. And I know there's people who write in, I think it's called Markdown. I've been fiddling with all that, but again, it's the trade-off between adding new tools and just wishing that my current tools all just talk to each other and just cooperated.
We've started moving our entire content process into WordPress using shortcodes and using other to actually include notes as shortcodes. It won't appear on the post, but will appear for the content team, so we don't have that problem. I think the one software that actually does a pretty good job of standardizing if you copy something in is Basecamp. If you actually copy something into a Basecamp thread, it keeps it in at least the consistent Basecamp formatting. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a laundry list of things wrong with Basecamp, the way that images are processed, being able to center sub-bullets, that I could go on and on. But that was something where, I know even copying from Evernote is another one that we use a lot. When you copy it into Basecamp, it formats it in Basecamp styling, which I think is something where at least is a step in the right direction from what you're talking about here.
Yeah, and my next thing is something you've already mentioned, and that is dictation. So if people listening haven't noticed, at November of 2015, Google rolled out their speech to text engine to all their services. So Google Docs, Google Keep, Google Sheets, all that, you can dictate, and it's pretty good. Like if you just,
it really is. I use it
really good.
I use it for emails sometimes. Another thing that I'll do is I'll use dictation if I'm walking to the metro.
Yeah.
For example, I don't have time to write an email, but I have an idea. I'll sit there and I'll either dictate it, right into Gmail and then just hit send.
Yeah, but what's challenging for dictation is that it's, in a lot of ways, it's a complete mindset change. I mean, the idea that you have your smartphone and you can write anywhere. I don't know, for me at least, it requires just a different mindset. Like right now is writing time. Like it could be. And then also talking as I want it to appear in text. Anyway, just something I need to practice.
Well, it's one of the biggest, and you'll remember this, it's one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to start this podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Because I know for me, writing was a challenge. It was challenging for me to dedicate the time. It was challenging for me to stay disciplined with it. And I am much more of a verbal person. It's something where I can process my thoughts using words. Like I actually find my direction in what I want to say by speaking. Yeah. And so the podcast really helped me, but still having something written down that I can reference quickly is going back and using the dictation for it.
Oh, yeah. I totally agree. Well, the last thing I think we need to cover, and no conversation on management and productivity can be complete without at least a brief mention about email.
Yeah.
I'll just share that I'm doing better about batching my email and learning all the keyboard shortcuts for Gmail, taking advantage of canned responses. You know, I think that goes back to front loading work where you take the time to write out a canned response to things, and it can, you know, incrementally shave more time off. But yeah, I just wanted to mention it, that it's always there and always will be.
I think it's also something where, and this is something I'm starting to learn, where I think email is just, it feels antiquated to a lot of people and almost to a fault, where you say, oh, I can't use email. Email's a thing of the past. And for me, I realized like I've worked over the course of my career in a pretty good process where I look at my inbox as a to-do list. Right. Like now it doesn't have the same organization. There are deficiencies to it, but I still have to ask people who have sent me things on Slack, sent me things in, you know, I still set up my Trello notifications to ping me as an email because that's how I know for me how I've gotten things done. And I think not trying to move away from email simply for the sake of moving away from email, but make sure that you're using it the way that works for you while recognizing that there is no universal application of email anymore. Yeah. Different people on the same team are going to view email very differently. We've got some folks that just like have nothing in their inbox. Like I live in Slack. Like that's where I keep myself organized. That's where I have the right reminders and I have the right integration set up. But for me, I keep organized in my inbox. And I think it's something where I would encourage people to consider the other options out there, but not feel as though you must get away from email if you have a suitable process. Yeah.
And I mean, right now my process works where I try to do inbox zero, where, you know, I batch processing, and every time I process it, it either gets deleted or transferred to something else like Trello, or, you know, my personal to-do list, which is on Google Calendar. But either way, everything gets out. But I do agree. It's person to person, and it's like you have to figure out your own process for doing email.
And you should, if you work with people consistently, try to understand theirs as well. Yeah. My team knows that if they need something reviewed, it has to be emailed to me. Like it can be Basecamp tagged as an email. It can be, you know, a notification from Trello where you can tag me specifically. So I set my notifications to get an email. But recognize when people use certain tools differently than you. I've got folks that I don't send anything through email because I know that they prefer to receive it in Slack. So if you can try to work, if you work in a larger team, you know, for us, we're in our double digits now, you know, you start to realize that assuming everybody uses these tools in exactly the same way is not only unrealistic, but it's inefficient. You know, find a way to use the tools in the way that supports your mentality, you know, the way that you process information, the way that you choose to communicate and stay organized. And, you know, paramount to all of that, to kind of reiterate what we started with, is it comes down to being disciplined within the constructs of what you've set up for yourself. If you can do that, you're going to be, you know, there's 100 different ways to skin a cat. You know, all these different project management options are available to you. The challenge is finding out what works for you and then making sure that you remain dedicated to that approach.
I think that's a perfect final takeaway. Well, you can find show notes, previous episodes, and our contact information at bamboochalupa.com. Please go subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcast app. And I have to say, as a quick aside, if you do not have a favorite podcast app yet, I recommend Pocket Cast for Android or Overcast for iPhone. podcast apps are a bit notorious, and these are both actually really good. They both have killer features like silent skip. So this where it automatically skips over silences in the recording, and it allows you to listen to more audio faster without missing out on any of the content. In addition to that, they have amazing design. Check them both out, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast. And either way, wherever you go, leave us a comment, rate the podcast while you're there. We learn a lot from your feedback, and those ratings and reviews helps others discover the show and help grow our audience, make it more the merrier, keep this thing going along. So for Brett Snyder, I'm Nate Shiver. Thank you for listening.